Hi, I'm Iain and welcome back to the Northland Workshop. Today we're going to be building this little desktop organizer. It's got a spot for papers or magazines. You've got a couple slots for envelopes, stuff like that. And you have this little drawer in it for pens, pencils, stamps, whatever you want to put in there. Now if this looks familiar, it's because I built this using the plans that were published in the December 2020 Fine Woodworking magazine. And this is issue number 285. So if you're watching this in December of 2020, you can probably go get this at the newsstand. If you're watching this in the future, I'm sure you can download a PDF of these plans from the Fine Woodworking website. So that will have all the dimensions, all the shapes, all that stuff for this. Now in the article, the author used through dovetails to join the case together. He used a special saw blade on the table saw, grounded 12 degrees to cut those dovetails. I don't have a special saw blade like that, so I decided instead of the through dovetails to use box joints. So you can see the box joints up here, down here. It works just fine. Other than that, it is exactly like how the magazine says to do it. I'm going to be using these reclaimed Douglas fir floorboards to make the desktop organizer, and because they're reclaimed, there's some stuff we need to do to them. If we look, the top has thick polyurethane on it and just years of scratches and normal floor wear. Not a big deal. However, if you look, it's tongue and groove flooring, and after years of grime and grit getting down into the grooves, you can see there's lots of grit packed in here. That's going to be an issue when we start machining this. So we got to be careful of that. The other thing is this came out of an old farmhouse, and for whatever reason, below the flooring, they decided to install tar paper. And this is regular old tar paper that you would find under a shingled roof. So all this needs to go, because for one thing it's going to affect how this thing feeds through the planer, plus I can only imagine what this stuff would do to planer knives. The good news is it's fairly easy to remove. I've been removing it earlier this morning with a paint scraper and an old chisel. After a few minutes with the paint scraper and the chisel, I'm left with something like this. It has the stains from the tar paper on the bottom, but it doesn't have any chunks of tar paper left. And I took the paint scraper and I went all the way across to remove any kind of embedded grit. Now that removes the grit on the surface. It doesn't do anything for the grit down in the tongue and the groove. And that's why I have this clamped to my workbench on a couple 2x4s, because I don't want to start cross-cutting this on the radial arm saw yet, because the grit that's in the edges is going to dull my blade, and that's a fairly expensive blade. The blade on my little circular saw, however, is much cheaper, so I consider that a sacrificial blade, and I'm going to use this to make the initial cross cuts. I've laid out what's going to be the top and the bottom of the organizer, and I've given myself a couple inches extra on either side, so that way any planer snipe or stuff like that won't be an issue. And now I can go ahead and make the cuts. Now it's time to figure out what to do with the tongue and groove and all the associated grit that's in them. And what I found to be the easiest way to deal with it is to simply cut them off. Now I'm going to use my bandsaw with a 1/2 inch blade with 3 teeth per inch, and the reason I'm doing that is, again, this is a fairly inexpensive blade. It's also an older blade, so it's nearing the end of its life, so if it catches some grit and dulls a little bit, it's not that big of a deal. Don't want to use the table saw because I don't want to sacrifice that more expensive blade. And I've set the fence a distance from the blade so I can cut off the tongue and I can flip it over and cut off the groove. These two pieces that make up the top are currently 3/4 of an inch thick. When I get done planing them down, they're going to be 5/16 of an inch thick. So I'm taking off quite a bit of material. That would take a lot of passes on the planer, and that would take a while. Plus, it's wear and tear on the planer knives. It's quite a bit faster to resaw them down to a 1/2 inch thick. The 1/2 inch thick still gives me plenty of wiggle room if the glue joint isn't perfectly flush all the way along to come back and plane it out smooth. So to resaw it, I've set up my bandsaw with a tall fence for resawing. This will give me plenty of support to put the piece of wood up against it. This is the smoother side, so I'm going to keep that between the fence and the blade. It's set 1/2 inch away from the blade, so when I get done the cut, I'll have a 1/2 inch thick board and a little 1/4 inch thick board left over. What I don't like right now is this big gap left over from the bandsaw cut, because no matter how much I squeeze it with the clamps, that's not going to close up. Now the easiest thing to do would be to bring this over to the jointer, and a couple passes with the jointer would take care of this whole issue and we could butt it tightly together. However, not everybody has a jointer, so what do you do if you don't have one? Well, we can always do it the old-fashioned way. It'll just take a little longer. So what I want to do is fold these two pieces in and then take it and put it in my bench vise. Here we have my number 5 jack plane. Here we have my rag in a can with a light coating of oil on it. I want to oil the bottom of the plane ever so slightly to make it push just a little bit easier. And what I want to do is essentially treat this just like the power jointer in reverse. The wood stands still, this moves across it. I want to start out pushing down on the toe of the plane with my thumb because I don't want it to rock like this and cause me to cut a chamfer on this end. When I get to the far end, I want all my weight on the back of the plane so that way it doesn't take a nosedive off this way. The idea is it starts flat and it ends flat. Because this is a fairly long plane, it's going to shave off the high spots and not hit the low spots. If I was to try to do this with, say, a block plane, that block plane would try to weave in and out of the bumps. Think of this as the road grader for wood. A road grader is very long, so that way it can smooth out the humps in the road. This is very long to smooth out the humps in the board. Now if this board was even longer, I could move up to an even longer plane, but for general purpose stuff, this seems like a good compromise. You'll also notice I have both pieces clamped in the bench vise because this way, if I'm not perfect on my angle side to side, the two angles in the pieces of wood should complement each other, and when I glue it up, it should still be flat. Here we go. If you look, that just took off a little fuzz, and I don't know if you can see it in camera, but if I look at it, I can see the couple places where it shaved something off. Each time I do this, the shaving should get wider and wider until eventually I get a full width shaving from both pieces. Once I get a continuous shaving from here to here on both pieces, I know that it's planed. With a thin layer of glue on both sides, I can go ahead and clamp it together. Now I'm not using any biscuits on this because this is a light duty piece. Plus, I'm going to be planing this down, and the last thing I'd want to do is expose a biscuit when I'm planing it. I've let the panel dry in the clamps, and I've taken it out and scraped the glue down on both sides, and then I went ahead and I planed one edge straight. The reason I did that is I'm now ready to rip the panel to its final width, and I'm going to do that here on the rail arm saw. I've set up the rail arm saw in its out rip mode, so the blade is facing away from the column, and I have it set up so that way the guard is as close to the top of the panel as I can get. Now, this is a very big rail arm saw, and because of that, there's still a fairly good gap right here. Ideally, I would be able to get this edge to within 1/8 of an inch of the top of this panel. However, for this thin 1/2 inch panel, this is as close as I can get. The other thing to be aware of is I need to feed this opposing the rotation of the blade. The blade rotates this way, so therefore I need to feed it this way. If I was to feed it from the other side, there's a really good chance the blade could grab it and pull it in, launching it across the workshop, possibly dragging my hand into the blade with it. With all that said, we are now ready to rip with the rail arm saw. With all the panels ripped to their final width, I can go ahead and start planing them down to their final thickness here on the planer. And now with the stop block installed, I can cut all the pieces to length. A 1/4 inch blade on the bandsaw is all it takes to cut out this curve. The sanding drum in my drill press does a nice job smoothing up this curve. Now I can use this to trace for the curve on the opposite side of the organizer. This is my simple box joint jig that I have for my table saw. It consists of a hardwood pin 3/8 of an inch wide that is exactly 3/8 of an inch away from a 3/8 inch dado, and that dado is made by the dado head. And the way this thing works, I've already cut the box joint on the bottom of the organizer, and now I've got the side, and to do the side, what I'm going to do is I put the final pin of the bottom in. I'm going to put this one right there and hold it right in that location as I pass it through the blade. Now I'm going to slide it over until it butts up to the edge of that pin. I'll make another cut. Once that's done, I'll set it down over the pin, and I will keep going along until I get to the front edge of the side. I've got the two sides flush to one another, and I'm going to mark out for the dados on both sides at the exact same time, and what that's going to do is make sure everything lines up. Now this is the bottom edge of the lower shelf. I'll mark the upper edge, and then I'll do the same for the upper shelf. The other benefit to laying it out like this with the two sides open and next to each other is this prevents me from accidentally making two of the exact same thing, because these have to be mirror images of each other, so that way the dados are on the inside. If I made two of them and put the dados on this side, that wouldn't work real well. My favorite way to cut dados is with the rail arm saw. So I've outfitted this rail arm saw with what's known as a wobble wheel dado head. And if I take the guard off, we can get a better look at this. And this dado head uses a single blade and a special hub that's attached to the blade that holds it at an angle with respect to the arbor. So as it spins, it wobbles back and forth, thereby cleaning out a wider swath than it would normally do if it was just running true. The nice thing about this is by turning the hub, I can adjust how much it wobbles back and forth and therefore change how wide of a groove it cuts. Now the reason I'm using this and not a regular dado head that has outside cutters and chippers stacked in the middle is my particular dado head, the thinnest it'll cut is a 1/4 inch groove. And for the top shelf on this little organizer, I need a 3/16 groove. Well, this one happens to go down to 3/16 wide, so I'm going to use it. So I'll get the guard installed on this thing, and we can go ahead and set the height. Now the easiest way to set the height on this thing is I have the scrap piece that's actually a cutoff from one of the sides, so it's the exact same thickness, and I'm going to take one tooth, it doesn't matter which one it is, just whichever one is lower, and I'm going to slowly lower the saw until the tooth just barely touches the piece of wood. Now on this particular saw, every crank of the height adjustment crank is 1/8 of an inch, and I want to lower this exactly 1/8 of an inch because the dado is supposed to be 1/8 of an inch deep. So what I like to do is line myself up with the crank so I'm staring straight down the crank, and I'm just going to turn it 180 degrees. Right there. Now I went a little bit past 180 degrees and then I backed it back up. That took out any kind of backlash that might be in the height adjustment, so I know I'm at exactly 1/8 of an inch. Now we can go ahead and cut the dados. What I've done is I've taken the fence and I've scooched it over about 1 inch so that way I get a new cut in it for this dado. And what that does is it gives me the precise location of where that dado is going to be. So I take the mark that I made on the side of the organizer and I line those pencil marks up with that cutout in the fence, and I know that that's exactly where this thing's going to be. Now I also have the mark here for where the dado needs to stop because it's not a through dado. So I'll keep going until I get to that mark, push it back, and then repeat it on the other side. In the magazine article, they have a little curved section that they glue onto the vertical divider after the vertical divider is in. Well, I decided instead of doing that, I'm just going to make that into the vertical divider. So because of that, I have this area down here that I need to cut out in order to conceal the stop dado on the upper shelf. I have this area up here that I need to notch out in order to conceal the dado in the top, and then of course I have this curve right here to cut out to give it the curve that it had in the magazine article. And to do that, I'm going to use the bandsaw. Now I've set up the rip fence to make the bottom notch. I'll do the same thing for the top notch and then cut out the curve freehand. The back of the organizer is going to get housed in a rabbet, and you can see I've cut the rabbet in this side and I've done it on the router table. The reason I did that is while the rabbet in the side can be continuous from edge to edge, because the finger is going to cover it, the rabbet in the bottom and the top has to be a stopped rabbet. Otherwise you'd see a notch in this bottom finger when it's all put together. What I'm going to do to make that stopped rabbet is start it with it up against the fence back here, pivot it in, push it to the other side until the cutout for the box joint lines up with the leading edge of the bit, and then tip it out. Then I'll be left with a little bit of material to clean up with a chisel, but the good news is I won't have a rabbit showing in the end of the case. Whether it's the stopped dados made on the rail arm saw or the stopped rabbets made on the router table, the issue is where the groove stops is not square. This one slopes up due to the round nature of the dado head. So what I need to do is to flatten out this end. And I have a 1/4 inch thick chisel, that's not an issue. But I didn't have a 3/16 chisel. So luckily I had a spare 1/4 inch chisel that is just a cheap chisel I got at Harbor Freight, and I took it to the bench grinder and I ground the sides down to where it's just under 3/16, and that's perfect for cleaning out these thin dados. So all I'm going to do is start at the end where the dado stopped. I'm just going to score down there and along the edge using the sidewall of the dado as my guide. Now I can go ahead and pare out the rest of the wood. Once I get down to the score mark, I'll simply cut down again, and I'm not using any kind of hammer pressure or anything like that. I'm just doing this with hand pressure because there's really not a lot of wood that needs to be removed, and the last thing I want to do is cause something to chip out. I've set the rail arm saw to the in-rip position, and I'm now ready to start ripping down the rails and stiles for the back panel of the little organizer to 1 inch wide. And because it's such a small piece, I've got my push block ready so that way I can keep my hand well clear of the blade. The rails and stiles that make up the back of the organizer need a groove cut in their edge. That does two things. It gives the panel that makes up the back a place to live, and it also gives the stub tenons a place to go so they get glued in. Well, to make that groove, the easiest way I know how to do that is to put the panel raising jig on my rail arm saw. So now with the blade horizontal, it sticks through the back here, and I can push these boards through on the flat. The issue with this is the opening in the panel raising jig is much too big, and the reason it's so big is usually there's quite a bit of blade sticking out in order to raise the panel. Well, I only have this thing sticking out 1/4 inch. So what I did is I took a scrap piece of 1/4 inch plywood and I just clamped it over the opening and cut through it to make a zero clearance insert. The other thing I did, because there's not much wiggle room on these, there's going to be about a 1/16 of an inch on either side to play with. I don't want this board to ride up, because if it did, the groove is going to not be centered and that's going to spoil the whole workpiece. So I took this scrap piece of wood, and cut a whole bunch of fingers in it and made a feather board. And what that'll do is keep this thing tight to the table. It'll also add some resistance to kickback because it really wants to push through one way and it grabs trying to feed back the other way. Now I can go ahead and feed all the rails and stiles through, making a groove. I want to make a tenon on the back pieces that'll fit into that groove. And here I have a test piece, and you'll see it's ever so slightly loose. And the reason I did that is I don't want this thing to be too big. If it's too big, I'm afraid, since these are only a 1/16 of an inch wall thickness, it's going to split. The other thing I gotta take into consideration is the glue sometimes makes the wood swell, and again, if that happens, I don't want to break out these little edges because they're only a 1/16 of an inch wide. So I've got it all set up with a little stop block, and I've got a combination blade in there. The nice thing about a combination blade is it leaves a flat bottom, so that way I can get the tenon to not have a whole bunch of little ridges in it. And when I glue this up, I want to be careful to just get the glue on the little tenons, not in the groove, because if it gets in the groove, it could get on the panel and keep the panel from floating, and I could have an issue down the line where it tries to crack. Especially since this is such a small panel, I really don't want to take any chances with it. Now it really isn't going to take much clamping pressure at all to keep this thing together. So I'm just going to take one clamp to start with, put it right in the middle just to hold it. I don't want to squeeze it too much because it could bow these two pieces in and open up the joint on the edge. Now with it still set like that, I'm going to go ahead, take my tape measure, hook it over that corner. This is 10 15/16 that way. If I hook it on this corner, it is 10 15/16 that way. So that's square. It's square, the joints are tight. I'm going to back away slowly from this thing for an hour and just let it sit there and cook. I'm sanding all the inside surfaces of the organizer right now because once I glue it all together, it's going to be really hard to reach in those little compartments and sand. I found the easiest way to apply glue to all these little dados is just with a thin stick of wood. And I don't need a lot of glue in these things because when the thing's all put together, because they're stopped dados, they're going to be trapped in there. So really all the glue needs to do is keep these pieces from rattling around. With the back panel square, I can be assured that the whole case is going to be square. The final thing we need to do is to make the little drawer. And I've planed this piece of wood down to 1/2 inch thick, and it's a little too tall for the drawer and it's way too long. So at this point what I want to do is mark the very edge of the case, so that way I know this will be a tight fit. I can always trim it down later. And I'll cut this to length over on the radial arm saw. Now I want to mark the height of the drawer front, and to do that I'm resting the bottom corner on this lip down at the bottom, and I'm marking where the top of the drawer opening is. Now I can go ahead and rip this to width. Now it's time to assemble the drawer, and this really couldn't be any simpler because it's a tiny little drawer and it just has a rabbited front. So all I'm going to do is put a little dab of glue in the first 1.5 inches of the groove. This is a solid wood panel, so I want it to be able to expand and contract out the back with changes in humidity, but I also want to use it to help lock in the front of the drawer because that's where all the pulling is going to happen. So a little bit of glue right in the front of that groove, the rest of it's free to slide. The front groove, however, is going to get glue all the way along it because this I want to lock in place so that way the bottom panel doesn't work its way out the back over time. And then just a little bit of glue in the rabbets. And a little bit of glue on the end grain of the side just to make me feel better. Now what I want to do is get this in there and put the bottom in, because the most important thing at this point is to make sure the dado for the bottom is lined up with the side and the front. Now that that's in there, I can tip it like this and put a little bit of glue on that side, a little bit of glue on the rabbet, and I can put this side on. Now what I want to do while I have this thing held together, double checking that everything lines up on the top and the bottom, and it does, I'm going to take some 23 gauge pin nails, some 5/8 ones, and just pin it to hold it in place until the glue dries. That way I'm sure it's not going to slide around on me. I can flip it around, make sure this side's lined up, and go ahead and pin that. Now the final thing I need to do is to install the back. To do that, I'm going to put a little bit of glue in these dados that I cut on the radial arm saw, and a little bit of glue on the end of the back. I don't want any glue on the bottom itself because that has to be able to slide in and out with changes in humidity. If I lock that in place, if this thing shrinks, it'll split, and I don't want that, especially as thin as this bottom is. There. With the back in place, I can go ahead and pin it. Now, as long as the bottom is square, I'm guaranteed that the drawer is going to be square. So I'll let that dry, and we can go ahead and turn a little knob for this thing. today I'm going to be turning the drawer pull with conventional turning tools. And these are high-speed steel ones, so the thing I like to do first when I get them out of their case is to hone them with the diamond slipstone. Once I have it all set, I will go ahead and start roughing this out. The order of operations for this is going to be to rough it out with the roughing gouge to turn this square piece of wood into a cylinder, and then I'll start using the parting tool and the detail gouge to turn this into a little drawer pull. I like that little knob. Now what I'll do is simply cut it off with my back saw, sand the top of it, drill a little hole, and we can mount it to the drawer. And there it is, ready for finish.